She said she should have married her ex. I told her to go find him. 24 hours later, she was crying on my porch with nothing but the clothes on her back and the realization that some doors, once closed, don't reopen. But that was just the beginning of what I had planned. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday. I'd been tracking anomalous trading patterns in the Southeast Asian markets when Victoria's phone buzzed against the granite countertop. She glanced at the screen, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over it like she was disarming a bomb. "Work call," she muttered, snatching it up and disappearing into the bedroom. Work call. At 11:47 p.m., from someone labeled BM in her contacts. I have what you might call an unusual memory. Numbers, patterns, details, they stick. It served me well as a senior portfolio manager at Hartwell and Associates. It's also served me well in noticing when my wife started lying. The whispering lasted 14 minutes. When she returned, her cheeks were flushed, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Everything all right?" I asked, not looking up from my laptop screen where the Nicky was painting red across my monitors. "Just client issues. You know how it is." I knew how it was. Victoria hadn't had a real client in 6 months. Her consulting business was about as legitimate as her claim that she needed a $3,000 handbag for networking events. The second crack came 3 days later at Meridian, the restaurant where we'd had our first anniversary dinner. Tori, she'd started insisting I call her Tori instead of Victoria, said it sounded more professional, was picking at her Chilean sea base when she dropped the bomb. "I ran into Bradley Morrison today." I kept chewing my steak, though it suddenly tasted like cardboard. Bradley Morrison, her college boyfriend. The one who dumped her senior year for a sorority president with better connections. "That's nice," I said. "He's CEO of Morrison Capital now. Did you know that? His own hedge fund. 50 million under management." She paused, stabbing a piece of fish. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if things had been different back then." Ah, there it is. The grass is greener syndrome. Funny how she never wondered about that when Bradley was broke and driving his father's hand-me-down BMW while I was paying for her MBA. "Probably the same thing that happened to his other 2 wives," I said. "Expensive divorces." She shot me a look. "That's not fair, Alex. People change." "Do they?" The argument that followed was predictable. She accused me of being negative, of not supporting her dreams, of being comfortable with mediocrity. I accused her of nothing, which seemed to make her angrier. We went to bed without speaking. She took her phone to the bathroom with her. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern solidified. Mystery calls at odd hours. New clothes that seemed designed for someone else to notice. Late nights at networking events that she couldn't quite explain. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I did what I do best. I gathered data. Tori had always assumed I was just a boring numbers guy, content to crunch data for other people's investment decisions. What she didn't realize was that boring numbers guys are the ones who always know where the bodies are buried. And I was very good at reading between the lines. Her credit card statements told an interesting story. Lunch at the Ritz-Carlton, drinks at the Penrose Hotel bar. A Victoria's Secret purchase that definitely wasn't for my benefit. I would have remembered. But the real revelation came when I checked our phone records. We'd been on a shared plan for 4 years, with me managing the account. The beauty of being the detail-oriented husband is that your wife never pays attention to these mundane administrative tasks. BM had called her 17 times in 2 weeks, always late at night or early morning. The calls were getting longer. I was inputting this data into a spreadsheet. Old habits die hard. When she walked into my home office without knocking. Her face was flushed with that post-workout glow, except she hadn't been to the gym. "Alex, we need to talk." I minimized the spreadsheet and turned to face her. She was wearing a new dress, something sleek and expensive that hugged her curves in all the right ways. For someone else. "What's on your mind?" She sat on the edge of my desk, a move that would have been seductive 6 months ago. Now it just seemed calculated. "I've been thinking about us." about where we're going. And I don't think we want the same things anymore. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. The micro-expressions were fascinating. Guilt, excitement, fear, all battling for dominance. She was building up to something big. What is it you want, Tori? I want to feel alive again. I want passion, ambition, someone who understands that settling isn't living. Someone like Bradley Morrison. I see, I said. And you don't feel alive with me. It's not that simple. Actually, it is that simple. You either do or you don't. She stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the city skyline. Our penthouse had been her dream when we'd bought it 3 years ago. Now it apparently felt like a prison. Bradley offered me a position at his firm, she said finally. Vice President of Client Relations. It's a real opportunity, Alex. A chance to be part of something big. Vice President of Client Relations. That was a creative euphemism. That's generous of him, I said. Especially considering he barely knows your work. He knows enough. The silence stretched between us like a wire ready to snap. She wanted me to fight for her, to make some grand gesture, to prove my worth. Instead, I asked the question that had been building for weeks. Do you love him? She flinched like I'd slapped her. It's a simple question, Tori. Do you love Bradley Morrison? I love the way he makes me feel. Like I'm worth something. Like I have potential. And I don't make you feel that way? You make me feel safe, comfortable, taken care of. She said it like a diagnosis of terminal illness. I nodded slowly, turning back to my computer. The numbers never lied. The patterns were always clear once you learned to read them. Then go find him, I said. She didn't leave immediately. I think she expected me to break down, to beg her to stay, to promise I'd change into whatever version of myself could compete with her golden boy ex. Instead, I went to work the next morning like nothing had happened. That was a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, I had a plan. The beautiful thing about working in finance is that everyone talks. Money makes people chatty, especially when there's gossip to be shared. By the end of the day, I knew more about Bradley Morrison than his own accountant. Morrison Capital Management was impressive on paper. $50 million in assets under management, aggressive growth strategies, the kind of returns that made investors salivate. But dig deeper, which I did, using every legitimate resource at my disposal, and cracks began to show. High turnover in key positions, 3 CFOs in 2 years, a pattern of risky investments that had paid off so far through luck and market timing rather than sound strategy. Most interesting of all, several former employees had left under mysterious circumstances, all bound by unusually restrictive non-disclosure agreements. I was compiling this information when my assistant knocked on my office door. Mr. Davidson, there's a call for you on line 3. Says it's regarding your wife. Elena Vasquez introduced herself as Morrison Capital's finance director. Her voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of an accent that suggested careful cultivation rather than natural origin. Mr. Davidson, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I believe we have some mutual interests to discuss. Such as? Your wife has been spending considerable time with my employer. I thought you should know that Bradley Morrison is not the man he pretends to be. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Midtown, neutral territory where neither of our firms had regular clientele. Elena turned out to be younger than her voice suggested, maybe 29, with dark eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of understated elegance that came from expensive education rather than expensive clothes. How long have you known? She asked, sliding into the booth across from me. 2 weeks of certainty, 3 weeks of suspicion. You? 6 months. Bradley's not particularly subtle when he thinks no one important is watching. She opened a tablet and showed me a series of photographs. Bradley and Tori at the Penrose Hotel, at a private dining room in an exclusive restaurant. In his Mercedes, her hand on his thigh as he drove. I'm not showing you these to hurt you, Elena said. I'm showing you because you need to understand what you're dealing with. And what am I dealing with? A man who's used his charm and his position to manipulate at least 4 women in the past 3 years. 2 former employees, 1 client's wife, and now yours. The pattern is always the same. He makes them feel special, promises them the world, uses them for whatever he needs, then discards them when they become inconvenient. What does he need from Tori? Elena's smile was sharp. Information. Your wife has been feeding him details about Hartwell and Associates' client portfolio. Trading strategies, acquisition targets, private merger discussions. Bradley's been using that intelligence to front-run your firm's major moves. The coffee in my cup went cold as the implications sank in. Insider trading, securities fraud. My wife wasn't just having an affair. She was committing federal crimes. Can you prove this? I've been documenting everything for months. Bradley thinks I'm just the bookkeeper, someone to balance his checkbooks and file his quarterly reports. He has no idea I have an MBA from Wharton and a CPA certification. Why haven't you gone to the authorities? Because I want to destroy him completely, not just wound him. A quick SEC investigation might get him a fine and a slap on the wrist. Men like Bradley Morrison have lawyers and connections. They wiggle out of things. Elena leaned forward. But a coordinated collapse? Financial ruin combined with personal humiliation and legal jeopardy? That's permanent. I studied her face, looking for tells, for signs of deception or hidden motivation. What I saw was cold intelligence and carefully controlled rage. What did he do to you? He hired me 18 months ago specifically because he knew I was brilliant with numbers. Then he spent 6 months trying to seduce me, making increasingly explicit offers to advance my career in exchange for personal favors. When I turned him down, he started undermining my work, questioning my competence in front of clients, making my professional life hell. Why didn't you leave? Because leaving would have been admitting defeat. And because I realized I was in a unique position to gather evidence of his various schemes. Elena closed the tablet. The question is whether you want justice or just want your wife back. I thought about Tori in that new dress, her face glowing with excitement as she talked about feeling alive again. About her dismissive comments regarding my career, my ambitions, my worth as a partner. Justice, I said. Elena smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had an ally. Then let's discuss strategy. Elena's apartment was not what I expected. Where I'd imagined a sterile corporate space, I found warmth, soft lighting, comfortable furniture, walls lined with books that showed signs of actual reading. She poured wine while I reviewed the files she'd compiled on Bradley's operation. He's been running what's essentially a Ponzi scheme, she explained, settling into the chair across from me. Not the classic version. He's too smart for that. But he's been using new investor money to cover losses from high-risk bets, all while reporting consistent gains to keep the money flowing in. The documents were damning. Falsified trading records, manipulated profit reports, client funds diverted to cover Bradley's personal expenses. Most devastating of all, a recorded conversation where he bragged about his insider intelligence network, including specific mentions of information from Alex Davidson's wife. How did you get this recording? Bradley likes to hold court in his office after hours, usually with a few drinks in him. His ego makes him careless. Elena sipped her wine. The man can't resist bragging about how clever he is. This is enough to bury him. Why wait? Because timing is everything. If I turn this over to the SEC tomorrow, he'll claim I falsified evidence out of spite for being rejected. His lawyers will create reasonable doubt, drag out the proceedings, probably get him a settlement where he pays a fine without admitting wrongdoing. She was right. I'd seen similar cases where financial crimes became legal technicalities, where the punishment never matched the crime. What's your alternative? Elena pulled out a calendar and spread it across her coffee table. Morrison Capital's biggest client presentation is next Friday. Bradley's trying to secure a $20 million investment from the Pemberton Foundation. Old money, very conservative, very concerned about reputation and propriety. I could see where this was going. You want to destroy him publicly. I want to destroy him completely. Financial collapse, criminal liability, and social humiliation all at once. The kind of fall that leaves no room for comeback. She outlined the plan with military precision. First, we would use Tori's access to my firm's information against Bradley by feeding her false intelligence. Merger rumors that would never materialize, acquisition targets that would prove worthless. When Bradley acted on this information, his trades would fail spectacularly. Second, Elena would time the release of evidence to coincide with the Pemberton presentation, ensuring maximum witness to his downfall. Third, and most personally satisfying, we would manipulate the situation so that Tori would be present to see her knight in shining armor revealed as a fraud. What about the personal aspect? I asked. Tori's not innocent in this. Your wife is a victim of manipulation, whether she realizes it or not. Bradley's been using her, promising her a future that was never real. When this falls apart, she'll be left with nothing. No job, no relationship, and potentially criminal liability for insider trading. Elena refilled our wine glasses. The question is whether you want her to suffer for her choices or have a chance to understand them. I thought about the woman I'd married 5 years ago, full of ambition and dreams, excited about building a life together. Somewhere along the way, that woman had become someone I barely recognized. Shallow, entitled, always looking for something better instead of appreciating what she had. I want her to understand, I said finally. But I also want her to face consequences. Then we give her a choice. When Bradley's empire collapses, she can either stand by him and face criminal charges, or she can cooperate with authorities and possibly save herself. Elena leaned back in her chair, studying me with those dark eyes. Are you prepared for what this might do to your marriage? My marriage is already over. Tori made that choice when she decided Bradley represented everything I couldn't give her. I'm just making sure she gets exactly what she asked for. Over the next week, I became a double agent in my own life. Every morning, I kissed my wife goodbye and went to work. Every evening, I came home and listened to her talk about her networking meetings and career opportunities. Every night, I coordinated with Elena to set the trap that would destroy her lover. The false information was easy to plant. Tori had grown careless, leaving her laptop open, taking calls in the next room. She thought I was too boring to pay attention to anything beyond my own work. During our dinner conversations, I would casually mention upcoming deals, acquisition rumors, market predictions, all carefully crafted lies that Elena and I had designed to make Bradley overconfident. Hartwell's looking at a major tech acquisition, I might say over Chinese takeout. Something in the artificial intelligence sector, could be a game changer. Tori would nod absently, but I knew she was filing away the information. Sure enough, Elena would report the next day that Bradley had moved significant capital into AI stocks, positioning himself for gains that would never materialize. The beautiful irony was that Bradley thought he was playing me. He had no idea I was feeding him a steady diet of financial poison, each morsel designed to make his eventual collapse more spectacular. By Thursday, Elena confirmed that Bradley had leveraged Morrison Capital far beyond safe limits, betting heavily on the false information I'd been providing. His presentation to the Pemberton Foundation was scheduled for 2 p.m. Friday. The SEC investigation would be triggered at precisely 1:45 p.m. He'll walk into that boardroom thinking he's about to secure the biggest deal of his career, Elena said during our final planning session. Instead, he'll walk into a room full of potential investors just as news breaks about federal fraud charges. And Tori? I've arranged for her to be there. Told Bradley that having his new VP of Client Relations present would show the foundation his commitment to expanding his team. Elena handed me a sealed envelope. These are copies of everything, the recordings, the documents, the trading records. After tomorrow, You'll be the only person outside of law enforcement who has this evidence. Why are you trusting me with this? She was quiet for a moment, looking out her apartment window at the city lights below. Because you could have handled this the easy way, confronted your wife, filed for divorce, walked away clean. Instead, you chose justice. That tells me you're someone who understands that actions have consequences. As I drove home that night, I thought about Tori lying in our bed, probably texting Bradley about their bright future together. Tomorrow she would learn that some futures are built on quicksand. The trap was set. All that remained was to watch it spring. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, appropriate weather for what I had planned. Tori was in an unusually good mood, humming while she got ready for what she believed would be a career-defining day. "Big presentation today," she said, adjusting her new earrings in the bedroom mirror. "Bradley thinks this could lead to major expansion opportunities." "That's wonderful," I replied, not looking up from my coffee and financial reports. "I hope it goes exactly as planned." She kissed my forehead, a gesture that would have been loving 6 months ago but now felt like a formality, and left for what she didn't know would be the last day of her fantasy. At my office, I spent the morning in meetings, maintaining the facade of normalcy, while my phone buzzed periodically with updates from Elena. 10:30 a.m. Bradley's in full swagger mode, practicing his pitch, talking about celebrating tonight. 11:15 a.m. Pemberton Foundation representatives just arrived, 3 very serious men in very expensive suits. 12:45 p.m. Your wife is here. Looks nervous but excited. Bradley introduced her as his new strategic partner. At 1:40 p.m., I excused myself from a client call and walked to my office window. Somewhere across the city, Elena was making the phone call that would trigger a federal investigation. Somewhere else, Tori was sitting in a conference room, believing she was about to witness her lover's greatest triumph. My phone rang at 1:47 p.m. "It's done," Elena said simply. "SEC Enforcement Division is moving now. Bradley should be getting the call any minute." I didn't have to wait long. At 1:52 p.m., my personal phone, the one Tori used for emergencies, exploded with frantic calls and texts. "Something's wrong. Bradley just ran out of the meeting. Alex, call me. Something's happened. Federal agents are here, at the office. What's going on?" I let them ring. Elena and I had agreed that I needed to maintain complete plausible deniability. Whatever was happening at Morrison Capital had nothing to do with Alex Davidson, boring numbers guy who just happened to work in finance. The news broke at 3:15 p.m. A brief item on the financial networks: SEC enforcement action targets Morrison Capital Management. By 4:30 p.m., the story had expanded. Hedge fund CEO arrested on fraud charges. By market close, it was front-page news. Morrison Capital collapse. Investors flee as criminal charges filed. The details were devastating. Federal agents had raided Morrison Capital's offices, seizing computers and files. Bradley had been arrested on charges including securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Early reports suggested investor losses could exceed $30 million. I was preparing to leave work when my personal phone rang again. This time I answered. "Alex?" Tori's voice was small, frightened, nothing like the confident woman who'd left our apartment that morning. "I need you to come get me." "Where are you?" "At the police station. They're asking questions about Bradley, about Morrison Capital, about information I might have shared." Her voice broke. "I think I'm in trouble." Now she understands. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The police station was a circus of reporters, lawyers, and confused investors trying to understand how Bradley Morrison had stolen their money. I found Tori in a small waiting room, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her perfect makeup was smeared, her expensive dress wrinkled and somehow shabby under the fluorescent lights. "Thank you for coming," she said when she saw me. I didn't know who else to call. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. Yet. They're treating me as a potential witness, not a suspect. But Alex, some of the things they're asking about. She looked up at me with genuine fear in her eyes. They know about our dinners, our conversations. They know about information I shared with Bradley. I sat down beside her, careful not to touch her. What kind of information? Client names, deal structures, things you mentioned about Hartwell's business. She was crying now, mascara leaving dark tracks down her cheeks. I thought it was just casual conversation. I didn't know Bradley was trading on it. Of course she didn't. In Tori's world, information was currency, but only in the abstract. She'd never made the connection between pillow talk and securities fraud. How much did you tell him? Everything. God, Alex, I told him everything. He made it seem like we were building something together, like sharing information was proof of trust. A detective approached us, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who'd probably seen every variation of financial crime the city had to offer. Mrs. Davidson, we're ready for you now. Tori looked at me desperately. What should I do? This was the moment Elena and I had planned for, the choice that would define Tori's future. Tell them the truth, I said. All of it. Everything you told Bradley, everything he asked you to find out, every conversation you remember. Cooperate completely. But if you do that, you might avoid criminal charges. If you don't, you'll go down with him. The detective was waiting patiently, but I could see her taking notes on our conversation. Everything would be part of the record now. Tori stood up slowly, smoothing down her dress in a gesture that was both familiar and heartbreaking. Will you wait for me? I looked at this woman I'd been married to for 5 years, this stranger who'd betrayed everything we'd built together for the promise of something better with someone else. She'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for, Bradley Morrison and everything that came with him. No, I said gently. I don't think I will. She flinched like I'd hit her. Alex, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can work through this. We can... You said you should have married him, Tori. I hope he was worth it. I left her standing there with the detective, walking out of the police station and into the cold evening air. My phone was already ringing, Elena wanting to know how the final act had played out. She's cooperating, I told her. She'll probably avoid jail time if she testifies against him. And Bradley? Bradley's finished. Even if he beats some of the charges, his reputation is destroyed. No one will trust him with their money ever again. I drove home through the city streets, past the restaurant where Tori had first mentioned Bradley, past the hotel where they'd conducted their affair, past the life we'd built and she'd discarded, for a fantasy that lasted exactly 6 months. Our apartment felt different, emptier, but also cleaner. I poured myself a drink and sat in my home office, looking at the financial reports I'd been reviewing that morning. The numbers were the same as they'd always been, but somehow they felt more honest now. My personal phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Thank you for trusting me with this. Justice isn't always clean, but it's necessary. I typed back, thank you for showing me that sometimes the best revenge is just letting people get exactly what they ask for. Outside my window, the city lights glittered like a circuit board, each one representing someone's ambition, someone's dream, someone's carefully constructed life. Some of those lights would burn out tonight. Others would burn brighter. Mine felt steady for the first time in months. The knock came at 11:30 p.m., 3 days after Bradley's arrest. I'd been expecting it, though not quite this soon. Through the peephole, I saw Tori standing in the hallway, still wearing the clothes from her police interview, looking like she'd been walking the streets for hours. I opened the door, but didn't step aside to let her in. Hello, Tori. I have nowhere else to go. Her voice was hoarse, exhausted. The FBI froze all of Bradley's accounts, including the company credit cards. My hotel room was paid for by Morrison Capital. They kicked me out this afternoon. I looked at the woman I'd been married to for 5 years, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Without the expensive clothes, the professional makeup, the aura of ambition and success she'd cultivated, she looked younger and more vulnerable than I remembered. Also smaller, somehow diminished. What about your parents? I told them I was getting divorced to marry a millionaire. I can't face them now. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the hallway. Alex, I know you have no reason to help me, but I'm asking anyway. Just for tonight. I'll figure something else out tomorrow. I should have said no. Every rational part of my mind, every wounded corner of my pride, told me to close the door and let her find another solution. Instead, I stepped aside and let her enter our apartment for what would be the last time. She moved through the space like a ghost, touching familiar objects with the careful reverence of someone visiting a museum. The coffee table we'd picked out together, the painting she'd insisted we buy on our honeymoon, the life she'd thrown away for 6 months of excitement. They arrested Bradley this morning, she said, settling into the corner of our couch. Perp walk, cameras, the whole thing. 37 counts including conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. How do you know? I was there, at the courthouse. She looked up at me with eyes that held no illusion left. I thought maybe I could see him, talk to him, understand what happened, but his lawyers wouldn't let me near him. I poured 2 glasses of wine and handed her one, sitting in the chair across from the couch rather than beside her. The distance felt necessary. What did his lawyers say? That he'd been cooperating with federal investigators for weeks, trying to minimize his exposure. That he'd provided them with information about his accomplices and co-conspirators. She took a sip of wine, her hands shaking slightly. They said I should get my own lawyer because he'd given them my name. Of course he had. Men like Bradley Morrison always had someone else to blame, someone expendable to absorb the consequences of their choices. Tori had been useful as a source of information, but she'd be even more useful as a scapegoat. Are you going to be charged? My lawyer thinks probably not, as long as I testify truthfully about what information I passed along and how Bradley used it. The prosecutor seems more interested in the big fish than the small ones. But you'll have to testify. In open court, about our marriage, our conversations, what I told Bradley and when. She looked at me over her wine glass. I'll have to admit that I betrayed you, publicly, under oath. I'd known this moment would come, had planned for it during those late-night strategy sessions with Elena. Tori's testimony would be the final nail in Bradley's coffin, but it would also be her public confession of infidelity and betrayal. Some forms of justice carry their own punishment. I'm sorry, she said quietly. For all of it. For Bradley, for the lies, for believing that what we had wasn't enough. She set down her wine glass and met my eyes directly. You deserved better. Yes, I said. I did. The honesty seemed to surprise her. I think she'd expected either forgiveness or anger, not this calm acknowledgement of reality. Is there any chance? She began, then stopped. Never mind. I don't have the right to ask. Ask anyway. Is there any chance we could try again? After all this is over, after the trial, could we try to rebuild what we had? I considered the question seriously, which was more than she deserved but felt necessary for both of us. Could we rebuild trust after betrayal? Could I love someone who'd proven themselves capable of such calculated deception? Could she be happy with ordinary contentment after tasting the excitement of forbidden romance? No, I said finally. What we had was built on the assumption that we wanted the same things, valued the same qualities in a partner. You've shown me that isn't true. People can change. They can, but they usually don't. And more importantly, they shouldn't have to. I leaned forward, making sure she understood. I'm not going to spend the next 10 years wondering when you'll meet someone who makes you feel more alive than I do. I'm not going to change myself into someone I'm not just to keep you interested. And I'm not going to pretend that what you did was just a mistake instead of a choice. She nodded slowly, tears starting to flow again. So this is it. We're really over. We were over the moment you decided Bradley Morrison represented everything I wasn't. I just made sure you got the chance to find out what that really meant." The words hung in the air between us like a confession. For the first time since this began, I saw recognition in her eyes, not just of what she'd lost, but of what had been done to her. "You knew," she whispered. "About Bradley. About what he was. You knew, and you let me go anyway. I knew he wasn't the man you thought he was. I suspected he was using you. But I wanted you to make your own choice about what was more important, our marriage or your fantasy about a better life with someone else. So you just watched while I destroyed everything. I watched while you made the choice you'd already made in your heart. I just made sure the consequences were educational." She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. For 5 years, she'd been married to the version of me that was content to be underestimated, happy to let others take credit, satisfied with quiet competence instead of flashy success. That man would have fought for her, would have tried to change himself to keep her, would have accepted some of the blame for her betrayal. This version of me understood that some battles aren't worth winning if they require you to become someone else. "You're not the man I married," she said. "I'm the man you taught me to be." We sat in silence for a long time, drinking wine and watching our marriage dissolve in real time. Outside, the city continued its relentless churn of ambition and desire, success and failure, people making choices that would define the rest of their lives. Finally, Tori spoke. "What happens now? Now, you figure out who you are when you're not trying to be someone else. You testify honestly at Bradley's trial. You find a way to support yourself that doesn't involve other people's money or other women's husbands." I finished my wine and set the glass aside. "You learn to live with the consequences of your choices. And you? I file for divorce on Monday. I start over. I find someone who thinks ordinary contentment is extraordinary enough." She nodded, accepting the finality of it. "Can I ask you something? Why did you help me tonight? Why let me stay here?" I considered the question. Why had I opened the door? Why was I sitting here having this conversation instead of letting her figure out her own salvation? Because despite everything, I did love you. And because I wanted you to understand the difference between justice and cruelty. What happened to you was justice, natural consequences for the choices you made. Leaving you homeless and desperate would have been cruelty. So this is mercy? This is me choosing to be better than the situation required. She slept in the guest room that night. In the morning, I made coffee and scrambled eggs while she showered and prepared to face whatever came next. When she emerged, dressed in yesterday's clothes but looking more composed, she found me reading the financial section and eating breakfast. "The story made the Wall Street Journal," I said, not looking up from the paper. "Bradley's bail hearing is this afternoon." She poured herself coffee and sat across from me at our kitchen table one last time. "Will you be there?" Number 3. My part in this is over. Your part? I met her eyes over the newspaper. "I was never trying to destroy Bradley Morrison, Tori. I was trying to save you from him. The fact that it took his complete destruction to accomplish that says more about both of you than it does about me." She left an hour later, carrying a single suitcase with clothes I'd packed for her. At the door, she turned back one final time. "I really did love you, Alex. In my way." "I know," I said, "but your way wasn't enough." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet apartment. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence, then returned to my coffee and the financial pages. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Saw the news coverage. How are you holding up?" I typed back, "Better than expected." "Coffee later?" "I'd like that." At 3 p.m., while Bradley Morrison was learning whether he'd be granted bail, I was sitting across from Elena at the same coffee shop where we'd first plotted his downfall. She looked different somehow, less tense, more relaxed, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Any regrets?" she asked. I thought about it seriously. Regrets about the marriage that had failed? About the months of deception and planning? About the methodical destruction of a man who'd made a career of destroying others? Only that it took me so long to see what was really happening, I said finally. I should have ended things with Tori months ago instead of letting her dig herself deeper. She had to make her own choices. You couldn't have saved her from herself. Elena was right, of course. Tori's betrayal hadn't been a moment of weakness or a single bad decision. It had been a series of calculated choices, each one taking her further from our marriage and deeper into Bradley's web of lies and manipulation. What about you? I asked. What's next for Elena Vasquez? The SEC has offered me a consulting position to help unravel Bradley's various schemes. Turns out there were a lot more victims than we initially realized. She smiled, the expression transforming her face completely. I think I've found my calling in financial forensics. And after that? After that, I'm thinking about starting my own firm. Help people who've been taken advantage of by predators like Bradley. Make sure the victims get justice and the perpetrators face real consequences. I raised my coffee cup in a mock toast. To justice. To consequences, she replied, clinking her cup against mine. We talked for another hour about everything except Bradley Morrison and Morrison Capital, about books and travel, about ambitions and dreams, about the kind of life someone might build after burning down everything false and starting over with truth. When we parted ways outside the coffee shop, Elena touched my arm gently. You know, for what it's worth, I think Tori was an idiot to trade you for Bradley Morrison. Thank you, but I don't think it was really about him in the end. It was about who she thought she wanted to be. And now she gets to find out who she actually is. I watched Elena walk away, disappearing into the crowd of afternoon commuters and urban professionals, all of them pursuing their own versions of success and happiness. Some would find what they were looking for. Others would discover, too late, that they'd been chasing shadows. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing client portfolios and market analyses, the familiar comfort of numbers and data, helping to restore my sense of equilibrium. The phone rang just after 6, my lawyer calling with news about Bradley's bail hearing. Denied, he said simply. Flight risk. The judge wasn't impressed with his cooperation efforts, especially after prosecutors revealed he'd been moving money to offshore accounts right up until his arrest. Outside my window, the city lights were beginning to twinkle as darkness fell. Somewhere out there, Bradley Morrison was sitting in a federal holding cell, probably still convinced that his charm and connections would eventually save him. Somewhere else, Tori was starting the long process of rebuilding a life from scratch. And here I was, alone in the apartment we'd shared, feeling more at peace than I had in months. My phone buzzed one final time. Another text from Elena. Dinner tomorrow? I know a place that serves excellent revenge, but I hear their second chances are even better. I smiled and typed back. I'd like that very much. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities. New chances to build something real with someone who valued honesty over excitement, substance over flash, partnership over conquest. Tonight, I was content to sit with the silence and the satisfaction of a job well done. Justice had been served. Consequences had been faced. The guilty had been punished, and the innocent, or at least the less guilty, had been given a chance to start over. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. Sometimes it's enough. The wine was excellent, and for the first time in months I had nowhere else I needed to be.